the first thing I saw was this highway that I had seen before, where it was lined on the, like if I'm facing it, it was lined on the left side with a forest, and a car was driving on this highway. And you can see that the straight ahead, you can see the sky really, really big. And the sky was actually really stormy and full of dark clouds and kind of thunder and lightning and things like that. And as this car's, driving through, you could see that the rain has started, and that the rain was really significant. I had to physically see the rain coming down by looking up at it, and so it was important. But what I saw was ahead of this car, the sky began to open, and you can see this lightning. Not lightning, but like a light curtain open. And it's going to be a little difficult for me to explain this. Just one second. Sorry. Okay. So when this like curtain opened up in the sky, the Lord sort of showed me this evil thing. Oh, I already forgot something. Okay. So the man or the person who is driving this car, when they're driving on this highway, there's all these stone bridges crossing over. There's bridge after bridge after bridge crossing over from one side of the highway to the other side into the forest. And as he's driving, some of these bridges, they begin to sort of fall apart. And then is when I start to see ahead in the clouds, this curtain open. And the evil that came forward out of this curtain was specific to me to be able to explain it. When I was a child, my mom allowed me to watch some really scary movies that I never should have ever seen. And so this is going to be a little PG-13, but I believe it's supposed to describe sort of the attitude of this enemy. But it was this really scary movie where this enemy had the face of this clown. And in this show, he lived under the ground in darkness, and he would lure children in with his words. So he would speak things that called to them. And once they said, okay, I'll go down there, he would pull them in and destroy them. And this was a movie. It's scary. Anyway, and so this is the face of this enemy that I saw as the head. That was the head of this enemy. And it had the body of a crocodile. And as it came out of this curtain, that's when I saw that it was huge in comparison to the human in the car. It was a monster. And as it came out with this body, it actually was when I'm facing him, he was on the right side. So this huge monster, this creature came, and he started walking along the side of the bridge that was not on the side of the forest. He started to crush every single bridge under his feet. And he actually passed the car. So I saw him coming forward to the right, crushing bridges, and then he passed my point of view in this car. And I turned around in the vision to see, and he just continued on crushing this part of the bridge. And that's as far as it.
Oh, it is a bit scary, huh? Yeah. Well, I think something, invoking your spirit about the spirit Wi-Fi, what it can do. So, yeah. I was reading on Isaiah 40, but Isaiah 40 is extension Isaiah 30, talking about the highway holiness, the core Lebanon going to be given to it. So, God knows how to link things together. I want to encourage you about that. So, yeah. Then he said, wild beasts not walk on it, stuff like that. So I was talking about a certain kind of engagement life is not allowed to walk on this one. So I don't know. I try to blurt out what came to my mind. So Yeah. So it seems Tim is still there. He might have some thoughts, a prayer, whatever encouragement for us. So let him wrap up for us instead. So. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for thinking about that. I don't have a whole lot to add. I just I do think that that's the highway overpass connections is very interesting in light of well, I don't know how to detail it out. I do think that it's very evidently connected to the spirit of Leviathan, like we were talking about earlier.
Mm. Yeah.
The luring nature. Earlier I mentioned something that was when I was talking earlier, something more specific about the subtle nature of that spirit, and the other side of it is the seductive nature.
Mm.
It's like I guess I did say that because I was using the illustration of the tentacles and bait and lures, but maybe focusing in on that a little bit as well. There's a draw.
Mm.
And that drawing away is the leading into another way of thinking.
Mm.
Paul encourages us to take every thought and submit it to Christ, make it captive, take it captive and submit it to Christ.
Mm.
And, again, we have this example of what it means to be led in another way, even in a certain way of thinking.
Mm.
We may think that a way of thinking is something that just becomes a natural flow to us, but I would submit that that's a lot further down the road than most of us are.
Mm.
For most of us, in order to really see a change in our way of thinking, there has to be a discipline applied in order for that to fully transition or mature itself over time.
Mm.
And, there will be mistakes and missteps along the way, which is the benefit that we have in being, as Emmanuel, and I was in and out a little bit, but in describing what it is to be the family of God. And that goes far beyond the typical definition of accountability.
Mm.
In a sense, the hand is not, it could be considered as accountable to the body, but it's not just accountable to the body. It's part of the body.
Mm.
What the hand does is consequential to the body. What happens to the hand is felt by the rest of the body in both explorative, positive, and negative ways. And so, in that sense, I think that we can't, and I think this is what was said earlier too. Again, I was in and out of hearing, but we cannot be separate. The people of God, no sheep is to be separated from the flock. And I think even last week we mentioned some of this in some other context that,
Mm-hmm.
the duty of the good shepherd, which we know the chief shepherd is Christ, and that he himself, through the Old Testament prophets, said that he would appoint for himself shepherds over his people.
Mm-hmm.
So when there is a shepherd in place, and by place we know we're not talking about position, we're just talking about God's assignment,
Mm-hmm.
that their spiritual duty, Paul called it a spiritual duty. He called it a priestly duty. And it was to enable those lives, even as the sheep were intended to be in the flocks of Israel, a sacrifice, an ordained sacrifice. But Paul, having full understanding and a greater view of God's work and what is the true priestly work in the house of God, and the true house of God, the spiritual house of God, the heavenly temple, is that he was to form and lead and protect and guide and care for these lives so that they might become in God's house, in God's temple, on the altar in heaven, a living sacrifice, something well-pleasing to God. I don't know how I got off on that because we're talking about the life and spirit. But
well, you just give a preview what I want to talk next session, talking about the.
Yeah. But these are the very things that the enemy wants to derail. And I think that it just in the ways, in some likeness to what Mindy prayed.
Yes.
In that this, and you said earlier, speaking out about and the spirit of fear, think of what the author of Hebrews talks about, this fear of death that has plagued God's people for so long. And, Jesus came to break this barrier so that we would no longer have the fear of death. Not only the fear of death as a punishment for sin, but the fear of dying to self. The
yes.
fear of letting it all go.
Yes.
And becoming, or at least allowing ourselves to be taught and raised to be in unity with the Father and his heart and his ways.
Yes.
And that's a fearful thing. And I really agree with Mindy there, There's something inside of us that would be more, in a sense, willing to die for our own sin than we would be just to die to ourself.
Yeah, quick and easy. It's over.
That's the easy way out.
Yeah.
And that's the encouragement of Jesus and the apostles. Wasn't die for your own sin.
Yes.
It was to take up the cross daily and die to self.
Yeah.
And these aren't new teachings in the realm of Christianity, but I don't know that they're very well traveled paths. And so, where the enemy would come and derail us, especially in light of a community of believers and God ordained leadership, however we want to describe that when those areas of discipline and death begin to be touched, well, then this invasive spirit comes to say, don't do this. This is bad for you. This person does not have your best in mind. And those are all thoughts that come right out of the very center of the soul and selfish ideas of what it means to be a part of the body of Christ, the spiritual body of Christ. And so, the first imagination that we take hold of in that light, it can literally run us off course so quickly, because we've already in the same way that Lucifer, that the devil, the serpent in the garden, he first, all he had to do was introduce some kind of fear, or introduce the idea that God would not do what he said he would do.
Yeah.
Or that somehow God's intention for them wasn't according to their desire. And when that ran out in the course of their minds very quickly, well, we all know that it leads to death. And, that principle is played out all through the Psalms, through Proverbs, through all the wisdom writings. Jesus talked about it. All the apostles talked about it. And they summarized it and detailed it in different ways. But it is one of the very, very fundamental, if we could call it tricks or, power plays that the enemy has.
Yeah.
And especially against God's people.
Yeah.
Satan would see the true spiritual body of Christ dismembered in every way possible.
Yeah.
Our culture looks at the devil and those kinds of things as physical things, carnal things, fleshly things, blood and gore and murder and those things. But in reality, and those things are evil, granted, but the real damage that the enemy has caused in the midst of God's people has been to completely castrate and dismember them. And he does it in front of all of the heavenly hosts. And he gloats over it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the very thing that should really stir something up in us. Not just against the enemy, but to be fully committed to the will of God for his people. Not the will of God's people for his people, but the will of God. There's a big difference. Man has, for long enough, for too many generations, through too many long portions of history, decided what God's will is for him because they think they understand it. But, the time has come for a change. And you know what? We're not the first generation to have people say that. There have been others who have preached the same message, but it hasn't happened yet. And part of that is just because we can't change God's sovereign timing and will. But I tell you what, we can submit to his will no matter what time it is. And let God be the judge of the rest. So